Hello and welcome back to Book Talk with Kara. Today I'm delighted to introduce you to Sarah Arthur, who is a new friend of mine, but someone that I know you're going to enjoy meeting. She has written nonfiction and fiction, and we're going to be talking about her new book, Once a Castle. But I also want to have the opportunity for you to learn about her nonfiction as well, because she sits at the intersection of talking about and writing about some of the great authors of um, Bilbo and Frodo and Madeline Lingle and just all of those people that we love to read about when we think about the great authors of kind of classic, um, really the people who created the space of Tolkien and Madeline Lingle and the space of just fantasy that all of us have loved for generations. But then she's now writing the fantasy that my nieces and my grandma and everybody are reading. It's crossing generations. It's so much fun. So, Sarah, before we get started talking about all this, I want to give you just a moment to introduce yourself so that everybody knows who you are. And then we're going to launch into talking about Walking with Bilbo and Once Upon a Castle and everything in between.
I am so delighted to be with you, Kara. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's people ask, how long have you been in publishing? And when I do the math, I realize it's been about 25 years because, like many writers, you start in an area where it's maybe more technical writing. So I was doing denominational curriculum. I had been in youth ministry for about 7 years, and so starting with that, and then, but as a child loving to write fiction, loving to read fiction with a particular leaning towards fairy tale and magical realism. Um, so like Ellen Montgomery has a bit of that in her. Elizabeth Goudge, if you've ever read The Little White Horse. I loved like E. Nesbit, a lot of those classic writers. And then, of course, as a child, discovered C.S. Lewis through my parents, who read aloud The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to us, read
Still a
all the
favorite.
Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
I was kind of a late arrival to epic fantasy on the scale of Lord of the Rings. Like I didn't quite get into it till high school and college. But yeah, reading Madeline L'Engle and her Wrinkle in Time. And so all of that really, I would say, kind of shaped the landscape of my imagination. And when I was in youth ministry, I loved engaging kids in the power of stories to help us explore spiritual truths and spiritual themes in some of those works. And you know, uh, right about at the time where I was sensing a call to get back into writing and actually make that my career is when the Lord of the Rings, those movies were in theaters. So we're talking like more than
Transformative.
20 years ago.
Yeah.
And to watch my kids, like those youth just like they're coming alive to this world and the characters and the call of goodness, like just that inexorable call to make good, to make the world better and to contribute to the good and the just and the beautiful. I was like, oh, they maybe don't even know that Tolkien was a Christian. I think that's where we need to start, right? Where is he getting this from? And so I wrote a book called Walking with Frodo that came out 2003, which makes me feel ancient. And it was a CBA bestseller, and that just kind of launched my career. So at that point, I made the turn from full-time youth ministry to volunteering, and then writing books for teenagers. So that was my start. Over time, I did a number of different kinds of devotional books for different ages. I wrote a series of anthologies. That were collections of poetry and fiction from throughout the centuries for Paraclete Press for the different times of the year. Uh, so yeah, if like all kinds of stuff. A book about Madeline L'Engle, A Light So Lovely, and but all along my heart was still like, no, that those stories that you've loved forever, why don't you give those a shot? And so Once a Queen finally, after 20 years of chipping away at it in the background, came out last year. Also a CBA bestseller, Christy Award finalist, which just blew my
Yeah.
mind. And now Once a Castle just came out, book two.
I love it. And that's actually where our paths first crossed was at the Christy Awards in
Right.
November, which
Yeah.
was so exciting because your first novel and like my 40th, I
You're,
think
that's
we're
great.
both finalists, which was so
Oh my
fun.
goodness.
But what's really fascinating to me is like I grew up loving L.M. Montgomery. Like Anne of Green Gables was one of those first novels that I fell in love
Mhm.
with. Loved, 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 loved Chronicles of Narnia. Loved it as a kid. Fell in love with it again as an adult,
Yeah.
listening to the audiobooks with I read them to my older kids, listened to the audiobooks with my youngest. Love the series. I have to tell you, Lord of the Rings could not read until the Peter Jackson movies came out. Just could not get into that world. And then the
I've
movies came
yeah,
out,
I've heard from so many
and
people
then
the
I was
same.
like, oh, now I can see it. Now I
Yeah.
have the visual and I
Yeah.
could plod through the books. And so let's talk for a moment about that. And like Madeline Lingle, when I was 13 or 14 and was like, I want to be a writer, I actually wrote to her and I have a letter or two from her
Oh my
in my
goodness.
collection
Oh my
of
goodness.
the different
So
authors that I wrote to.
circle back to me about that later because her daughter or granddaughter Charlotte would love to know that, and it would be
Ah,
really fun to get copies of that for their archives. So let's
oh, yeah, absolutely. Because I have it
let's
in it. My mom actually, after I got published, put together a binder with all the letters from like Frank Peretti and
oh,
Jeanette Oke and all the
oh,
people I wrote.
stop. Oh my
So,
goodness.
so I have it
Well,
in the binder
for
over
what it's
there.
worth, when I was young, maybe 10, I wrote to Macmillan because I wanted to thank C.S. Lewis for writing the Chronicles of Narnia, and they were like, "Sorry, sweetie, he's already dead."
Oh, yeah. All the people that we wrote, we were like, we want to be writers.
So you caught Madeline at just the right moment. That's yeah. So word to the wise to the listeners, write to those authors now while you have the chance to thank them for the
Yeah.
role that they've played in shaping your imagination and your understanding of your place in the world as a creative person, all of that good stuff, because you never know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, how did you, because it's very clear that, in your books, all of these different authors and the worlds that they created played a role in creating the worlds for
Mm-hmm.
Once a Queen and Once a Castle. So,
Mm-hmm.
how did, Tolkien and Madeline Lingle and C.S. Lewis, how did they influence? Because I mean, you wrote these nonfiction books
Yeah.
about their worlds and their lives.
Mhm.
How did that lead into your fiction?
Yeah. Well, if anything, my fiction led into those books because, like I
Okay.
said, I've been writing since I was young. And actually, Walking with Frodo came out, and it was within a year after that that I had the first seed of the idea for Once a Queen. And some of that was me trying to get a handle on different narrative arcs that and different uh, narrative devices that
Mm.
authors use. And I was really curious. It hit me after reading The Last Battle again for however the umpteenth time, which I could not bring myself to read till I was maybe an upperclassman in high school. I did not want Narnia to end. And the very first paragraph tells you that in the last days of Narnia. And I was like, nope. And
Yeah.
so I just couldn't till I had the emotional bandwidth as an older teenager to be like, okay, Sarah, there is
Yeah.
loss in the world. You can read this book. It's all right.
It's
Um,
fascinating.
it-
We were actually having that conversation last night. My adult children
yeah.
and our younger kids the teenagers were sitting around the table and they were like, I hate that book. I hate how it ended. It's terrible. And they were going on and on about how they loved five of the, Chronicles of
Yes.
Narnia. And then I forget which one. They're like, oh, the only reason it exists is to set up the last battle. And the last battle is terrible. It's an awful book. And
Yeah,
it was,
I
I mean, the
don't know.
reaction was so visceral and
It's
strong.
very visceral and for good reason. I mean, I think there's some shortcuts that Lewis takes that I've been arguing with him about ever since. And one of those was he kills off everybody we love before the end, but leaves Susan alone in our world, having endured a horrible tragedy where she's, it's like, not to give too many spoilers, but it has been out since 1950, whatever. So if people haven't,
It's been
it's
out
their
for
own
a
fault.
while.
But and I like people have mentioned her before and how that was unfair to her and the reasons why she doesn't end up with her beloved, community in the end seem really flimsy, the reasons Lewis and the characters give for that. And also, I've been arguing with him ever since, and you start to see this in Once a Castle more, about his depiction of characters from other cultures, that are maybe like medieval, Middle Eastern characters.
Mhm.
And so you see me, it's like when you sit down with your grumpy uncle at Thanksgiving and you love this guy, but this is your chance to be like, nah.
Yeah. It's
Um,
like when you're arguing politics and you're
yeah,
like, I'm going to
yeah.
step
Oh, yeah.
away, but I'm going to disagree with you. But
Yeah, in the most loving way
yep.
possible, but also because, like you said, my books are heavily influenced um, by the landscape and the themes of those authors, right? It's an homage to them.
Yep.
But it is also a chance. So, philosopher Alistair McIntyre calls tradition an ongoing historical argument between
Mhm.
about what are the goods that constitute our tradition, right? So, like, what are we aiming for? What is this vision of the good life? And that can change. That changes over time. The vision of the good life in medieval Europe was very different than it would be now.
Yep.
You and I would not have been landholding, voting, like no power.
I
You
would have really struggled. There's a reason
Yeah,
God placed me in this time period and
yeah,
not
yeah. You're
others.
you're a professor at a university. This is a big deal,
Yeah.
right? And we kind of take some of those things for granted. But the people that were heavily influencing Lewis and Tolkien's imagination in the way that they created their narratives, a lot of those were you know, uh, early Anglo-Saxon literature. They were the fairy tales that developed orally during the Crusades. So
George MacDonald.
how is that shaping what we think about women, what we think about people of Middle Eastern cultures? Like these are all like we have to pay attention to that, especially if we're going to be giving these books to our children and having meaningful conversations with them around the table when as adults they're like, I hate that book. So yeah,
Yeah.
well, yes, and why? Let's like, where does that come from, that reaction? So, yeah, so I have a main character, Eva, in Once a Queen. She's 14. She is meeting her British grandmother for the first time. And I love how the illustrator who did the covers put their profiles on the book. Once a Queen shows Eva's profile and her grandmother's with a crown, of course. And Eva is beginning to suspect that the fairy tales she grew up hearing as a child are maybe true, even though as a teenager she knows she's not supposed to believe in them anymore. Because that's the turn towards adulthood, right? What are we giving up that we love? What do we have to give up that isn't considered grown up? And this is her challenge as a 14-year-old. And it was for me too. And then she's interacting with this grandmother who has clearly, there's been some sort of rift in the family between Eva's mother and her grandmother. And nobody's talking about that. Grandmother at times seems maybe mentally unwell and unstable. What's going on with that? Nobody's really talking about that. Eva keeps trespassing, crossing lines she didn't know were there in the questions she's asking and the places she's wandering and the secrets she's trying to uncover. And she begins to realize that the fairy tales she once believed in might not only might they be true, but they might be the reason why her grandmother is so wounded.
Mm.
And that maybe grandmother might have been one of those characters. So yeah, that's my story in a nutshell. And yeah, so people will ask me, so is the grandmother Susan from Chronicles of Narnia? And in a way, yes, as a trope for all of the people that we know and have ever known who maybe at one point had sort of a firm sense of
Yeah.
trust and belief in a goodness at the heart of the universe and have since lost that either through skepticism or through trauma. You know, especially older adults that won't talk about it. And how do we
Yeah.
walk alongside them and continue to love them and allow them to have their own journey? So that's who she is. She's my grandmother.
Yeah.
She's, your child that has walked away from God. She's all the people we've ever loved, whose journey we have to respect and walk with them and love them anyway.
Wow. Wow. That's a lot packed into a book.
It is so much. That's why it took
Yeah.
20 years.
Yeah. So then what's the theme of Once a Castle? Because you've packed all of that into Once a Queen.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, everybody can understand now why that's been a bestseller and was up for
Oh,
the biggest award in Christian fiction. So then
oh,
what's
thank
going
you.
on in Once a Castle?
Once a Castle. Yeah. So Once a Queen originally was a standalone book. But once I had an agent that was going to be pitching my fiction specifically, uh, it quickly became clear that publishers, especially when you're a new author, are really interested for young adult in particular in a series. And so, we just sort of in the proposal, we were like, well, how about like Once a King and Once a Kingdom? I don't know. And so we were like, here's some possible follow-ups and sequels. and and then she was like, well, you should probably have some descriptions of those. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I don't know, maybe, one of them, maybe Frankie, Eva's friend that she meets in Britain, has some siblings, and we can layer that into edits for book one, just to set up that these siblings then become main characters in book two. And wouldn't it be fun if sort of giants show up in their little village, or, in the hills above their village, in which case one of his siblings should be named Jack. If you're gonna have a giant, you need a Jack. And
Yeah.
that's where Once a Castle starts. So there are five main characters in this book, which I do not recommend. Don't ever do that.
That's
Um,
a lot to manage.
you're basically writing five novels, and it's third person, limited omniscient. So each of them gets their time to shine, but you're not in their voice. It's not first person like Once a Queen was with Eva. Um, and each of these teenagers has a challenge in their own personality that they're trying to overcome, or in their own temperament or experience. And each of them has a different posture towards the stories of fairy tales they've heard as they were growing up. And each of them has an adventure and a role to play in a story that began long before they got there and will continue long after they're gone. So we have three of Frankie's younger siblings. We have Arash Tabari, who is the grandson of the Iranian refugees that run the bookshop and the tea shop in their village. And then we spend a lot of time in the fairy tale land that I invented called Ternival. That was hinted at in book one, but is now like the bulk of the action in the middle and end of the book takes place there. So with a teenager from there. Sarah.
Have fun.
So, yeah, yeah. And it was a lot. And I had to cram it all. Instead of 20 years, I had like 8 months. And now I'm
Yeah.
writing the third and final book in this cycle called and it's Once a Crown, will come out next January.
Well, and that's the difference when you're now under contract is often that
Mhm.
first book, you have all this time and you're writing it and you're, finessing it and you've got,
Mhm.
years to make it
Yeah,
beautiful and exactly what you want. And then all of a sudden you're under contract and you
right.
have 8 months to go from
Yes.
an idea to a finished book. So
Yeah.
what was that process like?
Uh, I'm still in recovery. Actually, I'm not sure I am, because I'm having to crank out book three now on that same pace. I've had to do kind of a crash course in understanding my own brain and how it works, understanding my own um, style of writing fiction, which is very different than how I write nonfiction. Nonfiction for me is kind of my natural voice. It's like how when you finally read Lewis's Screwtape Letters,
Mhm.
you think, oh my gosh, this guy was meant to write satire. That is who he is. He hated that book, having to write that book, and how he like the tone, but he was so good at it. And when I write a book like A Light So Lovely, which is the spiritual legacy of Madeline L'Engle, and I'm interviewing people for it, I have an argument and like my main thesis, and I know how to build that and sustain that over however many words and pages. I feel like when I'm holding fiction in my hands, it's like a huge balloon full of water, and it's just constantly like I'm just like, no, 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 no. Like I'm just constantly like, no, not over there, not over there. And it's an exercise in discipline, in uh, seeking input just as
Mhm.
quickly as I can. So I know when it's going off the rails or my characters are doing things that don't make sense. And I read the chapters every evening that I've just drafted to my 11 and 14-year-old sons. And if you want honest feedback, give your writing to middle school boys.
That'll do it.
That'll do it. No, mom, no, 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 that's totally sus. You don't understand what you just said. Please don't use that phrase. Okay, thank you. Good to know. Jack would never do that, mom. You can't have him do that. Okay, all right.
That's so funny. So as you're, juggling this balloon and trying to figure it out, what brings you joy in the process? Why do you
Oh,
keep doing it?
oh my gosh, just knowing that I get to read to them. I mean, what are the odds that 20 years after I began Once a Queen, I would now have children that are the ages of the audience that I'm writing for?
That's so cool.
I mean, it's not odd so much as like just a really clear and obvious divine timeline that I couldn't have imagined. There were times during COVID. I mean, Sam was only in first grade that I was reading aloud drafts of Once a Queen to them, and we wouldn't have had that time together
Mm.
without a global pandemic. Not that I would ever want that to happen to them again, but those are things you can't anticipate. And what brings me joy is that, and also just the reader feedback.
Mhm.
Once a Queen, like grown women will say, I read that, and then I gave it to my teenage daughter. And by the end of the book, I was crying, realizing all the questions I never asked my own grandmother and all
Mm,
the stuff that that generation never talked about,
yeah,
that I missed my opportunity, or I've been wounded and hurt by family members who have, mocked my
yeah,
faith or whatever. And I've just realized, a different posture towards them,
yeah.
grace and love and respect for their journey, and a willingness to just sometimes we have to leave the 99 and be out in the wilderness to find the one lost and hold them in our arms and be like, I'm here,
Yeah.
whatever it is. They're not going to get back to the pen immediately, and they may not in our lifetime. And that's not our, we just can only be with them. That's the gift that we've been given, is their presence in our lives. So
I love that. So as we kind of come to the end of our interview, I want to wrap up with a few quicker questions.
sure,
Um,
I'll try to
so
get quicker answers.
yeah, no, but this is great. I've been loving this. This has been so
Oh,
much fun.
thanks.
Um, so when you think about your books, because you've got so many different kinds of books, are there any that you think would make a good movie? And yours could be like
Oh,
docudramas or
oh,
epic movies. What do you
oh
think?
my goodness, what a great question. Um, well, my sons would tell you that Once a Castle needs to be a movie. It reminds me a bit of, I don't know if you've heard Andrew Peterson talk about his Wing Feather Saga, which is a
Oh yeah,
middle grade fantasy series, and he'll talk about the second book in that as like one big chase scene. And when I heard him say that, I was like, oh, maybe that's a thing, that second books have to be
yeah.
like, you've built this whole world, you've set up the conflict, and now like stuff's really happening, and there's a lot of running and
Well,
like
that's kind
literal
of like
chasing.
the second in the Lord of the Rings too.
Oh, it's yeah. And my characters, like the Lord of the Rings, in once you've gotten the setup and you're into this now, they're splitting off
Yeah,
in order to try to address these different things, or they get cut off from each other. And so you have all of these different threads, and what's, where it for some of them there's literal bad guys and people chasing them, and for some of them they've seen the enemy and it's themselves, right? So
mm,
it's like you have all these
yeah,
different things coalescing in one place, and I had to build into it places where the reader could just be like, okay, whew, let's take a break
yeah,
for a minute. Like, these characters need a nap, they need
yep.
need dinner, they need to pause in the woods and just like catch their breath, because so do I. So
It
my
always
son
makes
will tell
me
you Once a Castle. That's the
it always
one.
makes me think of in Jason Bourne, the first movie, where after the chasing, they get into
Yeah.
the parking garage and you just have that moment where they're like,
Yeah.
whew,
And it's a thing in the way that they, like, in the structures that they've developed for film.
yeah,
Um, and if you do something like the save the cat method
yeah,
for the 15 beats of a novel, which is what I called it, the save my butt method, because that thing, like, if I hadn't If I hadn't had that for Once a Queen, again, it would have been this like uh, holding multiple water balloons, trying to keep them from slipping through my arms. That has those built-in rests.
Yeah,
And the audience in a movie theater has to be like, okay, I really have to pee. I'll be right back. And the reader needs that too. You
yeah,
can't just drive at, it's a pacing thing.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Because you just need those moments to be like, whoo,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, a little bit like if you think of Prince Caspian, when the Pevensey children return to Narnia, they've been gone hundreds of years. There's a lot of catching up to do. And so
Yeah,
Trumpkin you have to have that walk through the woods where he's catching them up to speed on everything that's
yeah,
happened. There's a lot of Trumpkin, even after they rescue him from the river, where he's telling them what's going on and where they are. And, you know, it's war and things are not great. And there's a little bit of that in Once a Castle. Uh, so so now with Once a Crown, I got to tie it all together, right? Like we got to reach the end where all of the loose threads, and actually weaving is a huge theme in my series, is all these loose threads are, I've figured out what's happening with those. So if you're a praying type of person, I appreciate it.
that sounds, yeah.
You say a prayer.
When it's a tightly connected series, that third book is tough.
Mm,
It is really tough to pull it
yeah.
all together.
Yeah.
So, how do you celebrate when you finish writing a book? Because celebrations aren't easy.
So important. I will celebrate when I finish writing a scene or a chapter, because that's kind of how my brain works. I have to have these like external rewards. So guys,
That's
we're going
awesome.
out for ice cream, or like I'll, treat myself to chocolate or something special,
That's awesome.
when I finish a chapter or a scene. But then, yeah, when we celebrate a book, usually my husband takes me out for a fancy dinner, that we can't afford. But it's worth it, right? You have to kill the fatted calf sometimes to celebrate. And yeah, we do that. And then we just had a big launch party for Once a Castle at a local indie bookstore here in Lansing, Michigan. And not only did people come out in force to celebrate that from all different kind of networks in my life, but I was on TV for it. It was like my first TV spot ever with like local events going on. That felt like one big party. And then a dear friend of ours who has an incubator, has a bakery in our church's incubator kitchen, made an exclusive Once a Castle themed cupcake that we
Oh,
were able to give away as prize drawings at the party on this past Saturday. Um,
that's so fun.
Inspired by Mrs. Rastegar's pastries in the books, with Persian themed flavors. So cardamom, orange, and pistachio. And they were
Yum.
so good. And she called them the Carrick Hall exclusive cupcake.
I love that. That's so amazing.
And it was
So
a
fun.
surprise. Like I knew she was making treats, but I didn't know that she was going to do that.
Oh,
It
that's
was,
so fun. It's so
yeah.
fun when your friends
And
like go
totally,
overboard.
yeah, inviting people to celebrate with you. Because they're proud of you and they're excited.
Yeah.
And I would also say using that platform to then amplify other people's works. So at the
Yeah.
launch, then I was able to say, Liz Kruger of Honey Bun Bakery made these amazing cupcakes. And then people were grabbing her card and
Yeah.
where can I order stuff online? And that's another way to celebrate, is to
Yeah.
think and give back.
That's awesome. All right. So, where can people learn more about you and your books? Where online can they learn more and
Yeah, yeah,
find
it's
out
really
more about
simple.
Once the Castle?
Yep, saraharthur.com. And I recently just put on my events page links to where you can see me, hear me on podcasts like this one, and on the TV spot that I did, because people, they like to hear an author's voice apparently. So it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, so saraharthur.com is a great start. And then also Waterbrook is the publisher, and they work with, they're an imprint of Penguin Random House, which has done a wonderful job of promoting the Carrick Hall novels.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you,
And
Kara.
I
It's
know
lovely.
that authors are going to, or readers are going to love learning more about your books.
Oh, thank you so much. It was fun.